The early summer of 1940 is often remembered for defiance: sandbags piled around government buildings, barrage balloons drifting above London, and the resolute figure of Winston Churchill emerging as Britain's shield. Yet behind the confident posture that the nation saw from afar, a quieter and far more human battle unfolded in corridors with closed doors, shaded studies in Downing Street, and sleepless nights punctuated by the echo of air raid sirens. Churchill's war against Hitler was visible to the world, but the war against his own doubt, exhaustion, private grief, and the crushing weight of responsibility remained a secret struggle he shared with only a few. The man who spoke of victory with thunderous certainty moved through his private chambers with the heaviness of someone who feared that each misjudgment might seal the fate of millions. The pressure of leadership had begun to erode Churchill's health even in those early months. His face, so determined in public, often drained of resilience once journalists dispersed and aides closed the door behind him. He suffered from recurring bouts of insomnia that had haunted him since youth, but wartime exacerbated them into long, punishing vigils. The glow of his desk lamp illuminated strategic reports, casualty lists, and messages from commanders begging for reinforcements that did not exist. The silence of the night became an adversary, magnifying doubts he would never reveal in daylight. He paced, reviewed maps, and returned to his blotter again and again, chasing a clarity that sometimes eluded even him. Churchill's private war was rooted not merely in fatigue but in accumulated wounds of earlier failures. The ghost of Gallipoli, that disastrous First World War campaign for which he had been partly blamed, still lingered at the edges of his consciousness. The specter of that humiliation sharpened his awareness of how fragile public trust could be. Every decision now carried the potential to repeat past tragedy, and he feared that miscalculation could plunge the nation into an irretrievable abyss. This burden created a psychological battlefield far removed from the firing lines of France and the skies over England, one shaped by memory, fear, and the relentless expectations of a desperate nation. As France collapsed and the specter of invasion loomed, Churchill frequently withdrew to the map room, not only for strategic briefings but for a momentary sanctuary where he could think without the performative demands of leadership. Advisors noted that he would linger before maps longer than necessary, staring quietly, as though searching for some semblance of certainty in a world dissolving at the edges. Behind these private contemplations lay an acute awareness that Britain was nearly alone and that the hopes of democracy had contracted to fit the narrow island that the Luftwaffe now threatened to bomb into submission. Yet even as he projected unwavering confidence, Churchill grappled with the loneliness of command. He possessed an inner circle: generals, ministers, private secretaries, but ultimate responsibility belonged to him alone. He felt the isolation acutely whenever casualty reports arrived, or when mothers wrote pleading letters describing sons lost at sea or in the ruins of Dunkirk. He answered some of those letters personally, each one deepening the emotional cost he concealed from the public. His courage was genuine, but it was layered atop a core of deeply human vulnerability that wartime demanded he hide. The strain also seeped into his personal life. Though he maintained a loving partnership with Clementine, the war placed them on separate emotional trajectories. She worried constantly about his health, his heavy drinking, his poor sleep, his refusal to rest, and at times wrote him long, heartfelt letters urging him to guard his temper and preserve his strength. Churchill read these letters in private moments, the words reminding him that leadership had begun to erode not just his stamina but also the gentler parts of his character. He cherished Clementine's caution but rarely allowed the world to see how deeply her words affected him. Throughout these months, Churchill clung to small routines to maintain psychological balance. He smoked cigars not simply from habit but as a calming rhythm. He took brief baths, dictating notes even as he soaked, attempting to carve order from chaos. He occasionally retreated to a quiet garden corner at Chequers, where the rustling wind and distant scent of cut grass offered brief reprieve from the roar of war. These fleeting moments of calm were not indulgences. They were survival mechanisms for a leader who carried the existential weight of Western civilization on his shoulders. Thus began Churchill's quiet war, a war waged not on beaches or in skies, but in the recesses of the mind and the private chambers where leaders confront their fears alone. This invisible battle shaped every decision he made, every speech he delivered, and every risk he accepted. The public saw a titan. Behind closed doors lived a man fighting to maintain unwavering resolve while wrestling with the profound uncertainty of a world unraveling around him. His strength would become legendary, but its roots lay in this private struggle, a conflict he never intended the nation to see, yet one that defined the very essence of his wartime leadership. As the months of 1940 deepened, Churchill's private struggles grew more intricate, shaped as much by his fertile imagination as by the realities of war. Even in quiet rooms where the crackle of the wireless faded and the bustle of staff retreated down polished corridors, he carried an internal landscape marked by storms of doubt and sudden clearings of conviction. His mind, always active, often swayed between bold confidence and a more fragile introspection he rarely revealed. In the solitude of his bedroom or the muted lamplight of his study, Churchill revisited decisions made hours earlier, examining them with the precision of an artist scrutinizing a freshly painted canvas. The need for reflection was instinctive. The weight of leadership demanded he shape his thoughts into patterns as deliberate as his brushstrokes at Chartwell. Though he projected certainty across the airwaves, Churchill frequently endured moments when the vastness of the war pressed onto him like a physical burden. Late-night reports piled high on his desk chronicled the suffering of civilians in bombed-out neighborhoods, the destruction of coastal towns, and the brittle morale of soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk with little more than their lives. Each account revived memories of earlier conflicts he had witnessed firsthand: the Sudan, the Boer War, Flanders, ghosts of past battlefields that whispered warnings in the quiet hours. The sharp edges of these recollections mingled with the rawness of current events, creating a complex relationship between memory and responsibility that few around him ever understood. His imagination heightened the intensity of his fears. Churchill possessed not only strategic foresight but an artist's capacity to visualize consequences with unsettling clarity. When he studied reports of Luftwaffe capabilities or the uncertain loyalty of distant allies, he pictured Britain's coastline aflame or its great cities shrouded in smoke. He could almost hear the roar of invasion barges breaking against English sands. These visions were not delusions but the natural expression of a mind that processed reality in images, metaphors, and vivid scenarios. They sharpened his resolve, yet they also deepened his private anxieties, creating an emotional duality that left him exhausted even in moments of apparent triumph. The strain manifested physically. Churchill suffered recurring tension in his chest, bouts of dizziness and persistent fatigue exacerbated by relentless travel between London, Chequers, and military headquarters. His physicians worried quietly, prescribing rest he seldom accepted. The Prime Minister understood his limitations. No leader could ignore the fragility of the human body during such times, but he feared that appearing frail would undermine the collective spirit he worked tirelessly to fortify. Thus, he concealed his weariness behind confident gestures, measured steps, and the smoke of his ever-present cigar, whose rising tendrils masked the fatigue etched into the corners of his eyes. Creative expression had long been his refuge, yet during wartime even painting felt heavy with symbolic weight. The rare moments he allowed himself at an easel were tinged with guilt, as though he had stolen time that properly belonged to his country. Still, the act of mixing colors stirred something essential within him, a reminder that not all human endeavors existed within the sphere of destruction. When Churchill applied the first stroke to a canvas during a brief visit to Chartwell, it was not escapism but an act of inner repair. Each brushstroke became a quiet assertion that beauty, order, and vision still mattered, even when civilization trembled at the edge of collapse. Writing, too, became an emotional sanctuary. Dictation sessions with his secretaries often drifted into reflections deeper than their official purpose. He explored themes of endurance, destiny, and the moral duty of nations, intertwining historical analysis with the intangible threads of human character. These private literary explorations helped him make sense of a world that seemed to shift beneath his feet. They provided structure not only for his arguments but for his internal equilibrium, reinforcing his belief that narrative, the story of a people, of a leader, of a war, could anchor a nation through uncertainty. Churchill's closest aides frequently observed the contrast between the man who addressed the nation with resounding certainty and the man who paced his study afterward, shoulders naturally bowed in contemplation. They attributed this duality not to inconsistency but to depth. Churchill carried the burdens of state with the emotional breadth of someone who understood both the harshness of reality and the fragility of human spirit. He knew that genuine leadership demanded more than decisions. It required the capacity to absorb fear, to temper doubt, and to transform private vulnerability into public strength. In this process lay the essence of his quiet war. Even as the Battle of Britain approached, Churchill's inner struggles were inseparable from his public role. The visible defiance he embodied was built upon nights of silent reckoning, the hours when he confronted not only enemy strategies but his own emotional thresholds. He understood the paradox of leadership in wartime. The leader must appear stronger than he feels, braver than he thinks, more certain than circumstances allow. And yet, it was precisely this private reckoning that fortified him. By acknowledging his doubt and refusing to yield to it, Churchill forged a resilience that would carry Britain, and himself, through the darkest chapter of the 20th century. As the summer sky filled with contrails and the thrum of engines overhead, Churchill entered a period in which silence became both companion and adversary. The quiet moments between air raid alarms, between cabinet sessions, between telegrams delivered on trembling bicycle wheels, held an intensity that no bombardment could rival. He often found himself standing before a window at Downing Street, watching the city shift through shades of smoke and twilight, absorbing the stillness that followed destruction. In these intervals of uneasy calm, his thoughts traveled freely, to the past, to possible futures, and to the unspoken emotions he kept carefully hidden beneath the armor of his public image. It was in these suspended fragments of time that the full gravity of his role pressed most heavily upon him. He rarely allowed himself to express doubt openly, for he understood its contagious power. The British people needed unwavering conviction, not glimpses of a leader wrestling with uncertainty. Thus, silence became a protective veil, masking moments of hesitation, shielding private fears, and granting him space to rebuild resolve before the next announcement or strategic decision. Yet this same silence often intensified the internal turbulence that coursed through him. Without the release of conversation or confession, thoughts multiplied and echoed. Churchill, whose mind thrived on argumentation, debate, and intellectual exchange, had to navigate many of his most painful mental struggles alone. In these quiet chambers of reflection, Churchill frequently revisited memories that shaped his understanding of crisis. He recalled his near-fatal escape during the Boer War, his political exile in the 1930s, and the lonely years when warnings about German rearmament drew ridicule rather than respect. These experiences had steeled him, yet they also reminded him of how quickly public opinion could shift and how frail political fortunes could become. The ghosts of past failures sharpened his awareness that success in war was never guaranteed. His mind oscillated between hard-earned confidence and the lingering fear that any misstep might unravel the fragile tapestry of national survival. The silence also held within it the voices of those he could not save. Reports arrived daily detailing ships sunk in the Atlantic, airmen lost in the Channel, and families buried beneath the rubble of London homes. These accounts, written in the crisp factual language of military dispatches, carried emotional weight far heavier than their measured tone suggested. Churchill absorbed them in solitude, tracing numbers with his fingertips as though the gesture could somehow honor the fallen. He grieved privately, knowing that public sorrow from a leader could weaken morale. Yet in his loneliness, he formed a profound bond with the suffering of his people, one that deepened his determination even as it burdened his heart. The silence of wartime also intensified Churchill's sense of responsibility for generations yet unborn. He often imagined the judgment of history, picturing future readers examining his choices with the same scrutiny he applied to generals of the past. This imaginative projection brought both comfort and fear. Comfort because it affirmed his belief that courage, perseverance, and moral clarity would ultimately be remembered. Fear because it reminded him that history could be unforgiving, that a single failure might overshadow decades of dedication. In the solitude of night, Churchill grappled with this dual reality, that he was writing not merely wartime policy, but the narrative of a people's endurance. At times, silence provided a canvas for creative thought. Churchill would sketch ideas in notebooks, not only for military strategy but for speeches, phrases, and metaphors. The rhythm of language often took shape first in these quiet reflections, where he refined the emotional cadence that would later resonate across loudspeakers in bombed-out streets. He knew instinctively that words must carry both truth and solace, and that their power depended on the authenticity forged in silence. Thus, even his oratory, public and thunderous, had its origins in moments of private introspection. Despite his reliance on silent reflection, Churchill also recognized the danger of isolation. He sought, in deliberate moderation, the company of a chosen few whose presence offered grounding rather than noise. His personal secretaries, military advisors, and closest family members provided brief yet vital moments of human connection. These interactions, though often brief, acted as counterweights to the internal storms he weathered. He listened, argued, probed, seeking not validation but the clarity that comes from intellectual exchange. Yet even these exchanges were but temporary anchors. The greater weight of decision-making inevitably returned him to solitude. As the Battle of Britain reached its crescendo and the nation prepared for the long struggle ahead, Churchill's relationship with silence became a defining element of his leadership. The quiet spaces of his life, his study, the cabinet room, the dimly lit map room, transformed into emotional battlegrounds where fears were confronted, conviction strengthened, and the destiny of the nation considered with painstaking care. In these private arenas, hidden from the cameras and the crowds, Churchill fought the quieter war that few would ever see. It was here, in the tension between silence and action, between vulnerability and resolve, that the foundation of his wartime leadership was forged. By the time the Luftwaffe intensified its assault in the late summer of 1940, the strain of ceaseless decision-making had begun to shape Churchill's private life with an almost sculptural force. He moved through Downing Street as though each hallway carried a different emotional weather. One corridor heavy with anxiety, another with determination, a third with a quiet melancholy that lingered after midnight briefings. Behind the closed doors of his study, he often paused between dispatches, his gaze fixed upon the heavy drapes, the polished desk, the faint shadow of a portrait upon the wall. These small details, seemingly insignificant, became anchors for a mind buffeted by constant storms. Even in silence, the room seemed to echo with the clamor of the wider war, a reminder that tranquility was only an illusion granted by thick walls and dim lamps. Churchill bore the weight of these private tempests with a paradoxical mixture of stoicism and emotional sensitivity. While the world saw him as a leader of indomitable will, those closest to him recognized the fluctuations of mood that swept across him with the unpredictability of summer storms. He could move from blazing confidence to somber contemplation within the span of a single hour. The sheer volume of information he processed daily, military intelligence, foreign cables, domestic reports, kept his mind in a state of perpetual motion. This mental turbulence, when confined to quiet rooms, often transformed into an aching fatigue that pressed into his shoulders and settled behind his eyes. Yet he never allowed this exhaustion to seep into the persona he projected to the nation. The anxieties Churchill kept hidden were often shaped by the intimate tragedies revealed in daily reports. The destruction of homes in the East End, the rising number of orphan children, the anguish of families unable to locate loved ones after night raids, all of these sorrows reached him through terse official summaries. But Churchill read between the lines, imagining the scenes with an artist's emotional acuity. He pictured rubble-strewn streets tilted with moonlight, firemen exhausted but defiant, mothers clutching injured children amid drifting ash. These images were not merely products of empathy, they were the haunting reflections of his own fears about the fragility of civilization. In the privacy of his quarters, these visions weighed heavily, forming a somber counter-narrative to his public declarations of resolve. Churchill's temper, often misunderstood as mere impulsiveness, was in part a symptom of the invisible strain he bore. His frustration during staff meetings or impatience with ministers frequently masked deeper emotional tides. When a general hesitated or a department lagged behind expectations, Churchill felt the urgency of war tightening around him. Each delay risked not only strategic loss but moral erosion. Thus, his irritations, sharp but brief, reflected the intensity of his internal battle against time, fate, and the ever-present possibility of catastrophe. After such moments, however, he often retreated to solitude, quietly reviewing his own reactions as though they were brushstrokes needing adjustment. Clementine's presence, though physically intermittent during these months, served as a stabilizing force. Her letters offered gentle admonitions wrapped in affection, urging him to temper his outbursts and guard his health. Churchill read them in bed or at his desk, tracing familiar loops of handwriting that carried decades of shared life. Though he rarely responded at length, he carried her words with him like an internal compass. They reminded him of the need to remain not only a wartime leader but a humane one, a man capable of introspection as well as command. Clementine's love created a quiet sanctuary within his mind, a place where he could briefly set down the burdens of leadership. Despite the unrelenting pressure, Churchill continued to seek meaning in the smallest recesses of daily existence. He found solace in observing the faint glow of lamplight on polished wood, the gentle sway of curtains stirred by a passing draft, the muted chime of a distant clock. These sensory details, subtle and easily overlooked by others, grounded him in the present moment. They reminded him that even in the darkest hours, there existed fragments of order, beauty, and continuity. It was through this deliberate attention to the world's quiet textures that Churchill rebalanced himself, drawing strength from the very stillness that simultaneously threatened and sustained him. His private reflections were often shaped by a persistent awareness of mortality, not only the deaths reported daily but his own. Churchill understood that leadership in wartime placed him in the crosshairs of history, where triumph and catastrophe could hinge on his physical and mental resilience. He observed the toll the war exacted on colleagues, noting graying hair, tightened expressions, and the hollow fatigue of men who carried responsibilities of unimaginable breadth. In the silence of his study, Churchill confronted the fragility of his own body, acknowledging that he too was vulnerable to exhaustion, illness, and collapse. This awareness humbled him, strengthening his resolve to ration his energy with the same strategic care he applied to rationing aircraft and ammunition. Yet amid the storms that churned behind closed doors, Churchill emerged each day determined to present a figure of unwavering conviction. He understood that the nation needed a leader whose steadiness seemed unshakable, even if it was reinforced by private battles fought through sleepless nights and contemplative solitude. His quiet war did not weaken him, it honed him. The turmoil within forged a deeper connection to the suffering of his people and intensified his compassion. Though the public would never witness the storms he weathered in silence, it was precisely these hidden struggles that shaped the man who stood before them, a leader forged not only by history, but by the private crucible of his own heart. As autumn 1940 unfolded and the shadows lengthened over a nation battered yet unbroken, Churchill found himself living with a heightened sense of temporal awareness. Each day felt stretched between two worlds, the public arena where history was written in decisions and proclamations, and the private realm where hours unfolded with contemplative weight. He began to measure time not by clocks or schedules but by the emotional currents that shaped his internal landscape. The mornings, often filled with fresh reports of devastation, carried a heavy sobriety. Afternoons brought the relentless machinery of meetings, decisions, and messages that demanded swift clarity, and nights, when the hum of London dimmed beneath searchlights and sirens, held a quieter, more introspective burden. Time, once a neutral companion, had transformed into a force that pressed against him from all sides. Churchill navigated these days with a complex balance of ritual and improvisation. The familiar rhythms of his morning routine, tea, a dictated memorandum, a review of cables, offered stability amid the tumult. Yet the unpredictable nature of war meant that these rituals were often interrupted by sudden crises, intercepted communications from Berlin, pleas from commanders, or urgent updates from the Air Ministry. Each interruption demanded immediate focus, pulling him from one mental battlefield to another. In the space between these transitions, Churchill felt the strain of fragmentation. His thoughts, like scattered brushstrokes on an unfinished canvas, required constant gathering and rearrangement to form a coherent picture. Despite outward displays of energy, Churchill's body bore the subtle marks of unrelenting stress. His gait, once brisk and purposeful, occasionally slowed during the long walks between rooms. The weight of his famous overcoat seemed heavier on some evenings, the fabric pulling at his shoulders as though absorbing his fatigue. Even his voice, resonant and commanding in public, softened in quieter moments, revealing a raspy undertone that hinted at sleepless nights and endless speech drafts. His doctors noted the signs with concern, yet Churchill brushed aside their warnings, insisting that the demands of war required a willingness to push beyond ordinary limits. Privately, however, he acknowledged that each day consumed a little more of his strength. The burden of leadership was amplified by the emotional toll of visiting bomb sites. These journeys into ruined neighborhoods, conducted often without fanfare, were among the most searing experiences of Churchill's wartime life. He walked through streets where homes had collapsed into heaps of brick and glass, where families sifted through debris for belongings that survived the inferno. The smell of smoke clung to the air, mingling with the metallic scent of twisted steel and the lingering dust that settled on his coat. Churchill met survivors with a quiet empathy that contrasted with his public defiance. He listened to their stories, absorbed their grief, and carried those impressions back with him, adding them to the silent archive of emotional memory that guided his resolve. In these devastated landscapes, Churchill confronted the fragile border between hope and despair. He recognized that morale, though intangible, could determine the fate of nations as decisively as armaments. Thus, he approached each interaction with a solemn awareness of symbolic responsibility. A hand laid gently on a shoulder, a few carefully chosen words, a moment of shared silence. These gestures carried weight beyond their simplicity. Yet the emotional price of these encounters was steep. After returning to Downing Street, Churchill often retreated for a few minutes of solitude, allowing the rawness of what he had seen to settle within him before he resumed the work of command. These pauses were quiet rites of recalibration, moments when he acknowledged the depth of pain that no policy or proclamation could fully ease. Amid the relentless burden of days, Churchill continued to draw strength from the interplay of imagination and history. He would sometimes recall lines from classical literature or passages from his favorite poets, allowing their rhythms to steady him. These brief literary interludes served as reminders that humanity had endured suffering and uncertainty long before the present conflict. He found solace in the continuity of the human story, recognizing that his struggles, though immense, were part of a wider tapestry woven across centuries. This historical perspective tempered his anxieties, anchoring his emotions in the enduring resilience of those who came before. The burden of days was compounded by Churchill's acute awareness that every choice he made would reverberate far beyond the present. Decisions regarding convoy routes, aircraft deployment, or diplomatic messages had consequences that extended across oceans and continents. This sense of global interconnectedness created an intellectual weight as taxing as any physical demand. Churchill often compared these strategic dilemmas to navigating through fog, where only fragments of information illuminated the path ahead. Yet even in this haze he trusted the instincts honed through decades of public service, instincts sharpened by reflection, tempered by experience and fortified by an unwavering sense of duty. Despite exhaustion, Churchill never lost his sensitivity to the emotional contours of each day. He understood that leadership in wartime required not only strength but depth, an ability to feel profoundly without being overwhelmed. The burdens he carried shaped him into a figure both heroic and human, forged by a mixture of courage, fear, insight, and vulnerability. While the world saw a leader who seemed tireless, the private Churchill lived each day with an awareness of its emotional and historical gravity. These burdens, embraced quietly and borne with determination, formed the hidden backbone of his wartime leadership, the unspoken testament to the quiet war he fought within himself. As winter approached and the nights lengthened across Britain, Churchill found himself increasingly attuned to the psychological landscape shaped by darkness. During these months, when daylight seemed fleeting and the moon cast its pale glow over a city scarred by bombardment, the Prime Minister's internal world grew more complex. Nightfall became a mirror in which he confronted fears, hopes, and memories with sharper clarity. The soft crackle of the fire in his study, the muted ticking of distant clocks, and the rhythmic turning of pages on his desk seemed amplified by silence. In these quiet chambers, Churchill felt the weight of the war not as a series of strategic battles but as an all-consuming presence that seeped into thought, emotion, and the very structure of each long night. Churchill's relationship with night had always been intimate. He was a man who worked best under the cover of darkness, drawing upon its stillness to anchor his thoughts. Yet wartime nights carried a different tone, charged with anticipation, dread, and the ever-present possibility of air raids. He often stood by his window before retiring, gazing upward into the blackness streaked with faint beams of searchlights. The distant hum of engines or the sharp echo of anti-aircraft fire stirred not only tactical concerns but deeper reflections about Britain's endurance. Nightfall, with its blend of vulnerability and quiet, pressed him into a contemplative state that both nourished and challenged his spirit. In the privacy of these evenings, Churchill revisited the chain of events that had brought the world to such a precipice. His mind traced the arc of history with the precision of a historian, weaving threads of ancient conflict, political miscalculation, and human ambition into a tapestry that explained, but never fully justified, the suffering around him. He pondered the fragility of peace, the flaws in diplomacy, and the recurring patterns of human folly. These reflections, though heavy, helped frame his understanding of the present. They reminded him that every decision he made would echo into the future, shaping not only the outcome of the war but the legacy of the era. Night also awakened Churchill's imaginative tendencies. As darkness settled over London, he found himself sketching ideas, sometimes literal drawings, other times conceptual outlines for speeches or strategic proposals. The quiet hours loosened the constraints of daylight responsibilities, allowing him to explore possibilities with creative freedom. He could envision potential offensives, diplomatic maneuvers, or shifts in public sentiment as vividly as he imagined landscapes upon a canvas. This nocturnal creativity was not escapism. It was part of how he processed uncertainty, transforming anxiety into insight through the act of imaginative exploration. Yet night also held shadows that Churchill preferred to keep hidden. There were evenings when exhaustion pressed against him with unyielding force, draining him of the vigor he displayed before advisors and ministers. Insomnia, a longtime companion, often returned with renewed insistence during these months. He would lie awake, the ceiling above him fading into darkness, while his mind churned through scenarios of invasion, political dissent, and military loss. These solitary battles with sleeplessness left him vulnerable to moods of melancholy. Though he seldom admitted it, Churchill knew that the war's emotional toll was altering him in subtle ways, deepening certain strengths while eroding certain reserves. The hours before dawn were often the most difficult. There was a haunting stillness to this time, when the city seemed to hold its breath before the demands of a new day. Churchill sometimes paced the floor, wrapped in a robe, reviewing drafts or flipping through reports as though seeking refuge in activity. It was in these liminal spaces between night and morning that his doubts emerged most clearly, questions about strategy, leadership, and the immense human cost of every decision. But it was also in these moments that he reaffirmed his purpose. The very act of confronting doubt strengthened his resolve. Acknowledging vulnerability allowed him to rise with renewed determination when the first streaks of light appeared. Despite the heaviness of night, Churchill remained deeply connected to the people beyond his windows. He often imagined the countless households across Britain enduring the same darkness. Families gathered around fireplaces, air raid wardens patrolling dim streets, mothers comforting children as distant bombs thudded against the horizon. This shared experience bound him to the nation with a sense of intimate solidarity. The thought that millions faced night with courage infused his private reflections with a quiet admiration and a profound sense of responsibility. Their resilience, lived silently in blackout rooms and bomb shelters, became the invisible thread that stitched his private doubts into public resolve. When dawn finally broke, its muted light filtering through the smoke-tinged air of London, Churchill often experienced a subtle transformation. The weight of night did not vanish, but it settled into its proper place, another element in the intricate mosaic of his private war. With morning came the return of duty, the resumption of speech and action, the necessity of appearing steadfast. Yet the insights, fears, and quiet revelations of night remained within him, shaping the intuition and empathy that defined his leadership. In this rhythm, darkness shaping light, quiet shaping strength, Churchill fought and won the unseen battles that enabled him to lead the nation through its darkest hours. As 1941 dawned and Britain found itself entering yet another year of relentless conflict, the unspoken costs of Churchill's leadership deepened into a private burden he could scarcely share. The demands placed upon him were not solely strategic or political, they were profoundly emotional. Every telegram announcing the sinking of a convoy, every memorandum outlining the destruction of a factory, every quiet note from a minister detailing shortages and sacrifices added a new layer to the unseen weight he carried. In the polished calm of the cabinet room or the shaded recesses of his study, Churchill absorbed these realities with a composure that concealed the internal shock each loss delivered. Though he had prepared his entire life for crisis, nothing could fully brace him for the scale of suffering that now unfolded under his watch. Much of this cost manifested in subtle shifts of his inner world. Churchill, who possessed a naturally vibrant temperament, found himself moving through days marked by sudden descents into solemn reflection. He remained outwardly determined, but those closest to him observed the flicker of fatigue in his eyes, the moments when he paused too long between sentences, or the quiet sighs that escaped him after reading a message too painful to ignore. These were not signs of defeat, but of a man funneling immense emotion into the well of his resolve. He understood that the nation needed a leader who seemed unbreakable. Yet even the strongest walls develop hairline fractures under continuous strain, and Churchill felt these fractures within himself more acutely as the war ground onward. One of the deepest private costs was the erosion of personal time. Churchill had never been a conventional family man. His career had long demanded travel, risk, and prolonged absences, but wartime erased nearly every remnant of domestic normalcy. Though he cherished moments with Clementine and their children, these were increasingly rare, overshadowed by the pressing urgency of national survival. Letters from his family became emotional lifelines, offering glimpses into a world beyond war. He read them slowly, savoring the affection in each line. Yet they also reminded him of the life he could not live, a life temporarily suspended by duty. In the quiet of his residence, he sometimes allowed himself to imagine a time when peace would restore these connections, though such hopes remained distant flickers on the horizon. Churchill's friendships too bore the strain of war. Some colleagues became confidants, providing essential companionship in moments when isolation threatened to overwhelm him. Others grew distant, their relationships strained by disagreements or the sheer intensity of political and military demands. Churchill, who valued loyalty above almost any virtue, felt the sting of each fracture keenly. He carried a deep-seated fear that wartime decisions, no matter how justified, might sever bonds he had spent decades building. This anxiety seldom surfaced in public, but in private moments he reflected on the fragility of alliances, both personal and political, and the emotional cost of leading through crisis. Churchill's sensitivity to human suffering intensified the private toll of leadership. The stories of children orphaned by air raids, of cities reduced to rubble, of sailors lost in icy waters haunted him with a persistence he rarely admitted. His powerful imagination transformed these accounts into vivid mental scenes: streets shrouded in dust, the mournful cries of survivors, the silent grief of those searching for missing loved ones. These images were not abstractions. They shaped his sense of responsibility with almost physical force. In the solitude of night, he often revisited them, allowing himself the empathy he had to silence during the day. It was this emotional depth that strengthened his leadership, even as it carved its quiet toll across the landscape of his heart. The unspoken costs extended into the realm of hope. Churchill's public optimism, steady, fierce, unwavering, was in truth a carefully managed force. Privately, he fought to maintain the emotional equilibrium necessary to sustain that optimism. There were moments when the sheer scale of German power, the vulnerability of British supply lines, or the uncertainty of American intervention threatened to darken his internal outlook. In these moments he turned to the sources that had long steadied him: history, literature, painting, and the reassuring continuity of enduring ideas. The very act of seeking inspiration revealed the ongoing battle between hope and despair within him, a battle he refused to lose, even in his most isolated hours. His quiet conversations with trusted aides often hinted at the depth of his emotional struggle. Though he rarely spoke openly of fear or fatigue, his tone would soften unexpectedly, or a thoughtful silence would linger where once there had been brisk authority. These subtle moments, invisible to the public, revealed a man who understood that vulnerability was not weakness but a measure of humanity. Churchill allowed himself these brief openings not to seek pity, but to maintain emotional honesty in the company of those who helped shape the nation's survival. Their loyalty and understanding formed an invisible support system, one that steadied him when the burdens of leadership grew too heavy to bear alone. Yet despite the profound personal costs, Churchill never wavered in his resolve. His private struggles did not diminish his public strength, they forged it. The complexity of his emotions, his fears, doubts, hopes, and sorrows, gave him a depth that made his leadership not merely strategic but profoundly human. It was this humanity, shaped by unspoken costs and silent endurance, that enabled him to speak to the soul of the nation. In every speech, every decision, and every gesture, there existed the invisible imprint of the private battles he fought daily. These internal victories, unseen by history's broader narrative, became the quiet foundation of his role as Britain's steadfast leader in its darkest hour. Through 1941's shifting uncertainties, Churchill came to understand that leadership demanded the navigation of multiple front lines, some traced on maps, others drawn across the hidden contours of his own spirit. Behind the confident posture he presented to Parliament and the photographs that captured him striding through bombed districts, a quieter battlefield consumed his thoughts. It was here, in the recesses of his mind, that he confronted the intangible forces that threatened to erode his stamina: creeping doubt, emotional fatigue, and the crushing sense of accountability that no military staff could help carry. In this private realm, he fought battles as fierce and consequential as any waged in the skies above Britain. The inner front lines were defined not by enemy formations but by the constant recalibration of judgment. Each decision demanded rapid clarity: whether to divert aircraft to a new front, how to interpret intelligence hints from Europe, or whether to trust signals from Washington and Moscow. These choices were made with urgency, yet their aftershocks played out slowly within him, as he examined and re-examined their implications with the thoroughness of a historian. His mind, always active, operated like a vast internal war room, where possibilities moved in disciplined formation, retreating or advancing as circumstances evolved. This ceaseless mental activity, though essential, came at a personal cost that few could appreciate. The intensity of this inner scrutiny was heightened by Churchill's fear of misjudgment. The ghost of Gallipoli remained embedded in the architecture of his memory, an enduring reminder that even visionary leaders were vulnerable to strategic error. This fear did not paralyze him. Instead, it drove him to approach each decision with a meticulous balance of intuition and analysis. But in private moments, he sometimes felt the lingering sting of that earlier failure, a whisper reminding him that the margin for error in this war was unforgivingly narrow. These reflections infused his internal battles with a nuance unseen by those who witnessed only the outcome of his choices. The pressures of the inner front lines often coalesced at night, when the map room fell silent and the corridors outside his study emptied. Churchill's thoughts moved with particular intensity during these hours, guided by a blend of anxiety and imaginative foresight. He would mentally walk through scenarios unfolding miles away: convoys slicing through perilous waters, pilots ascending into dark skies, soldiers patrolling freezing beaches. He imagined their fears, their courage, their small moments of reflection. This empathy, rooted in the sensitivity he rarely displayed outwardly, became both a source of strength and a wellspring of private anguish. To feel so deeply for those he led was to shoulder their hardships as his own. Yet amidst the mental fatigue, Churchill also found pockets of unexpected resilience. His creative mind, so central to his evolution as an artist and writer, became a psychological shield of extraordinary power. He drew upon the emotional vocabulary honed through years of painting, light and shadow, contrast and harmony, to interpret the war's darker moments with a wider perspective. Just as a painter steps back from the canvas to gain clarity, Churchill learned to distance himself temporarily from the immediate crisis, allowing space for insight. This practice, grounded in his lifelong engagement with imagination, kept him from being consumed by despair. Churchill's sensitivity to atmosphere further defined his inner front lines. The sound of distant bombers, the scent of smoke drifting through open windows, the shuffle of papers carried by anxious secretaries, all these sensory elements fused into a landscape that influenced his emotional state. He processed these impressions with the depth of an artist, finding meaning in their subtleties. At times, a single detail, a slant of early morning light across his desk, the muffled footsteps of a messenger, a faint tremor in the walls during night raids, would stir a cascade of thoughts. These sensory cues shaped the internal terrain on which his private battles unfolded, reminding him that leadership existed in the intersection between external events and internal response. On especially difficult days, Churchill's burdens manifested in quiet moments of physical stillness. He would remain seated long after a meeting ended, his hand resting lightly upon a map or a memorandum, his eyes unfocused as though fixed upon something far beyond the room. These pauses were brief but profound, akin to the moment before a diver takes a breath. To observers, they suggested contemplation. To Churchill, they were moments of emotional recalibration, opportunities to steady the mind before re-entering the storm of decision. It was in these intervals that he reminded himself of the resilience that history demanded of him, of the fortitude Britain needed him to embody. Despite the profound challenges of these inner front lines, Churchill emerged from them with a strengthened sense of purpose. The hidden battles he fought each day, battles against doubt, fear and overwhelming responsibility, shaped the essence of his leadership. They sharpened his empathy, fueled his perseverance, and infused his public declarations with an authenticity that resonated across the nation. It was this invisible labor, carried out far from the cameras and crowds, that gave depth to his defiance and steadiness to his resolve. Churchill's quiet war, waged within the confines of his own mind, became the unseen foundation upon which the wider struggle for freedom was built. As Britain's war effort expanded and alliances slowly formed across oceans, Churchill found himself confronting not only the enemy abroad but the mounting expectations of millions who placed their hopes in his voice and judgment. Each speech he delivered, whether broadcast in the smoky hush of a bunker studio or given in the charged air of Parliament, became a lifeline for the public. This devotion, though deeply moving, added another layer to the burden he carried. Churchill felt the weight of these expectations acutely. He understood that his words could steady frightened households, shape international opinion, and influence the morale of soldiers standing watch on frozen outposts. The immense responsibility of this role settled upon him with a gravity that seldom reached the surface of his expression. The pressure intensified because Churchill knew that the nation saw in him not merely a leader, but a symbol of resilience. His figure, captured in newsreels and newspaper sketches, had become entwined with Britain's collective identity, stubborn, courageous, unyielding in the face of adversity. Yet in private, he worried that this symbolic status left little room for human frailty. He feared disappointing the people who looked to him for certainty, and this fear deepened the quiet struggle he waged within himself. There were evenings when he asked, in the solitude of his study, whether he could truly sustain the unwavering resolve the public imagined him to possess. This pressure was amplified by Churchill's intuitive understanding of narrative, his awareness that history was not merely lived but interpreted. He feared that future generations might judge his decisions without comprehending the urgency and ambiguity of the present moment. This concern led him to scrutinize every speech, every directive, with almost literary precision. He labored over phrases, weighing the emotional resonance of each sentence, mindful that wartime language carried an enduring weight. His secretaries often marveled at how swiftly he shifted from strategic deliberation to rhetorical craftsmanship, yet they saw only glimpses of the deeper anxiety that drove this disciplined attention to detail. Churchill's awareness of expectation also shaped his interactions with the military. Admirals and generals came to him with plans, concerns, and arguments, each meeting layered with the unspoken acknowledgement that the Prime Minister held the power to alter the trajectory of battle. Churchill respected their expertise yet felt compelled to question everything, mindful of the unforgiving calculus of war. His insistence on thorough examination often left him emotionally drained. In private, he replayed these discussions in his mind, revisiting tone, nuance, and implications. The pressure to meet expectations, his own, the military's, the public's, pressed upon him long after meetings ended. International expectations brought another dimension to this internal pressure. As Britain's lifeline stretched across the Atlantic, Churchill became the face of a nation fighting alone, appealing for support while refusing to show desperation. His communications with Roosevelt carried both strategic urgency and emotional restraint. He sensed that America watched not only Britain's strategic position but Churchill's personal steadfastness. Every message had to convey strength without arrogance, vulnerability without weakness. Crafting these communications became an emotional exercise as much as a diplomatic one. When he sent a cable across the ocean, he often sat in silence afterward, feeling the tension between hope and apprehension linger in the room like a fading echo. Within Britain, political expectations added further strain. Members of Parliament, newspapers, and the public scrutinized every decision, every rumor of discord, every shift in policy. Churchill managed these pressures with a combination of instinct, experience, and sheer willpower, yet the criticism that filtered through inevitably pierced the armor he wore. Though he rarely allowed anger or hurt to surface, he internalized these judgments in a way few realized. During quiet moments, he sometimes reflected on the precariousness of political trust, how swiftly it could be won or lost, and how deeply its fluctuations could wound a leader committed to public service. To counterbalance these mounting expectations, Churchill cultivated small rituals of emotional grounding. He spent a few minutes each day observing the activity in the garden at Downing Street or Chequers, birds alighting on branches, leaves stirring in the wind, the shifting interplay of light and shadow. These moments offered him a brief escape from the relentless gaze of public expectation. In observing the natural world, he rediscovered the continuity of life beyond the immediacy of conflict. The quiet, organic rhythm of nature reminded him that time moved with a broader cadence than the urgent tempo of war, providing a subtle reassurance that the present crisis, though devastating, remained part of a larger, enduring flow. Yet even with these moments of solace, Churchill felt the pressure of expectation as a near-constant companion. It shaped his posture, his tone, and even the pace of his steps. But rather than crushing him, this pressure refined him. It pushed him to embody the very qualities the nation needed to see: resilience, clarity, and moral resolve. The quiet war he fought within himself became inseparable from the public struggle for Britain's survival. In carrying the weight of expectation, he discovered a deeper reservoir of strength, one forged not through invulnerability, but through the courage to persist while privately confronting the full breadth of human doubt and emotion. As the war expanded across continents and oceans, Churchill increasingly retreated into the intellectual refuge of strategic contemplation, a quiet, meticulous world where maps, reports, and intuition converged. This realm, though outwardly analytical, was deeply intertwined with his emotional and imaginative life. In the solitude of the underground war rooms, with the low hum of ventilation and the dim glow of electric lamps casting long shadows across the walls, Churchill often felt a profound stillness settle around him. It was within this stillness that he sought clarity, balancing the cold arithmetic of war with the inner need to grasp its moral and human dimensions. Strategy for Churchill was not merely the movement of divisions or the allocation of aircraft, it was a form of thought that demanded both intellect and soul. He often approached strategic planning as though studying a complex painting. Churchill would lean over a map, his cigar glowing faintly, and trace the intricate contours of coastlines with the same attention an artist gives to the curve of a horizon. Each line represented not only geography but human stakes: the lives of soldiers defending distant shores, the fate of supply routes vulnerable to enemy attack, the morale of populations clinging to hope in besieged regions. This artistic sensitivity infused his strategic mindset with an emotional resonance that few around him fully appreciated. The decisions he made on these quiet nights bore the imprint of imagination as much as calculation. But strategy also demanded a form of emotional detachment that challenged Churchill's natural disposition. He had to weigh the loss of ships against the preservation of convoys, the risk to a town against the need to strike the enemy, the potential suffering of civilians against the broader imperatives of long-term victory. Each choice, though rationally justified, carved subtle wounds across his conscience. These wounds seldom healed fully, Instead, they accumulated, shaping the internal landscape of his quiet war. When alone, Churchill sometimes rested his hand upon the smooth surface of a desk or the arm of a chair, grounding himself in the tangible world as a counterbalance to the abstract heaviness of strategic responsibility. In these quiet sessions, the presence of history felt almost palpable. Churchill often sensed the company of past commanders, Marlborough, Nelson, his ancestors, and the great leaders whose portraits lined the corridors. Their legacy shaped his understanding of strategy as a dialogue across time, a conversation carried through centuries of conflict and struggle. He felt both strengthened and burdened by this lineage. The knowledge that he walked in the footsteps of giants provided a sense of continuity, yet it also reminded him of the unforgiving scrutiny history would eventually apply to his own decisions. This awareness lent each strategic choice a solemnity that deepened his private reflections. The quiet of strategy was punctuated by brief but intense bursts of inspiration. Churchill's creative mind often produced sudden insights, unexpected solutions, inventive maneuvers, or reimagined approaches that cut through layers of complexity. These moments resembled the sudden clarity an artist experiences when a composition begins to cohere. His advisors, accustomed to his intuitive leaps, learned to recognize the shift in his demeanor when such inspiration struck. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the subtle forward tilt of his posture, the unmistakable energy that radiated from him. Yet few understood that these flashes were shaped not only by intellect but by the emotional groundwork laid in long hours of contemplation. Despite these moments of clarity, Churchill also encountered stretches of doubt. Some nights, strategy felt like navigating a labyrinth with unseen walls. Intelligence reports conflicted, allies hesitated, and the enemy adapted with disconcerting speed. In these moments he wondered whether his instincts, shaped by earlier wars and enriched by imagination, could truly guide him through a conflict of unprecedented scale. These doubts rarely broke through his public confidence, yet in private, they lingered like shadows cast by the lamplight. Churchill acknowledged their presence, recognizing that doubt was a natural companion of responsibility, not a sign of inadequacy. To counterbalance the strain of strategic uncertainty, Churchill cultivated moments of mental reset. Sometimes, after hours of deliberation, he would step away from the maps and walk through the empty corridors of the bunker. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly, and he often found comfort in the coolness of the air and the solidity of the walls. These walks allowed him to disentangle thoughts, to let intuition rise to the surface without the pressure of immediate decision. At other times he paused to observe the simple rhythms of the staff at work. Messengers delivering cables, typists transcribing orders, officers in hushed conversation. These quiet human scenes reminded him that strategy existed not in isolation but in a living ecosystem of shared effort and courage. In the end, the quiet of strategy was not a retreat from the war but a deeper engagement with its essence. It was here, in the interplay between maps and imagination, fear and insight, solitude and responsibility, that Churchill shaped the decisions that would influence the arc of the conflict. This private battleground, silent, demanding, emotionally charged, was one of the most defining elements of his wartime leadership. Though the world witnessed the outcomes of these strategic deliberations, only Churchill knew the full extent of the internal struggle that lay behind them. It was on these unseen front lines that he fought some of his most critical battles, forging resilience from silence and clarity from the storm. As 1942 unfolded, a year of uncertainty marked by distant defeats and precarious hopes, Churchill encountered a subtle but persistent companion, doubt. Not the doubt that cripples action, but the quieter, more insidious kind that emerges in the margins of thought, in the pauses between decisions, in the stillness of corridors emptied after late-night meetings. This flicker of doubt lived in tension with his immense confidence, creating an emotional chiaroscuro that defined the inner life of his wartime leadership. He recognized it not as a weakness, but as an integral part of the human experience, a reminder that leadership was not measured by the absence of fear, but by the ability to act despite it. Still, its presence unsettled him, whispering questions about the future, the nature of sacrifice, and the limits of human endurance. These doubts often surfaced when news from abroad arrived stained with disappointment, losses in North Africa, setbacks in the Far East, grim assessments from commanders faced with impossible odds. Churchill absorbed these reports with a seriousness that belied his outward resilience. He knew that Britain's survival still hung upon a fragile thread woven from determination, alliances, and the unpredictable tides of war. After hearing such news, he sometimes withdrew to his study, allowing silence to settle around him like a heavy curtain. Here, removed from the demands of others, The flicker of doubt became sharper, illuminating the delicate balance he maintained between strategic optimism and the stark reality of global conflict. Churchill's imaginative mind, which so often fueled his vision, could also amplify his doubts. He possessed the ability to visualize outcomes with startling clarity, both triumphant and catastrophic. In quiet moments, he imagined the enemy advancing across desert sands, ships sinking beneath roaring waves, or cities collapsing under bombardment. These mental images were vivid, shaped by his artist's eye and historian's knowledge of how swiftly fortune could change. Yet this same imagination also conjured visions of resistance, resilience, and ultimate victory. His inner world became a battleground where fear and hope clashed repeatedly, neither fully claiming victory but each shaping his emotional landscape. Despite these inner conflicts, Churchill refused to let doubt erode his outward leadership. In public, he spoke with a steadiness that calmed and emboldened. But the effort required to maintain this poise exacted a profound private toll. After delivering a speech that stirred the nation, he often returned to his quarters physically drained, the emotional exertion lingering like a weight across his shoulders. He was acutely aware that a single wavering note, a moment of hesitation, could unravel the fragile morale of millions. Thus, he treated each public appearance as a performance of necessity, an act of emotional fortification that concealed the flickers of doubt haunting his private thoughts. His closest aides, attuned to the subtle shifts in his mood, occasionally glimpsed the depth of his quiet struggle. They witnessed the long pauses before he signed orders, the way his hand rested against his forehead during moments of intense reflection, the heavy exhale after reading a casualty report. Though they admired his resolve, they also sensed the vulnerability beneath it, a reminder that leadership did not make him invulnerable to sorrow. These private glimpses deepened their loyalty, inspiring them to shield him from unnecessary pressures and support him through moments when the burdens of command threatened to overwhelm his reserves. The pressure of doubt intensified during solitary late-night reviews of military dispatches. Churchill would sit alone at his desk, surrounded by maps marked with arrows, circles, and cryptic notations. The glow of a single lamp cast soft light over the documents, and the faint sounds of the bunker formed a distant backdrop. In these moments he confronted the full complexity of the conflict, the interconnected fronts, the fragile alliances, the harsh arithmetic of war that demanded decisions with irreversible consequences. Here, doubt took on a sharper edge, challenging his assumptions and forcing him to interrogate each judgment with renewed rigor. Yet this internal questioning ultimately strengthened his leadership, refining his decisions rather than undermining them. Churchill's method of combating doubt was not denial, but transformation. He treated doubt as an intellectual stimulus, a force that compelled him to refine ideas, reconsider possibilities, and approach strategy with a deeper sense of realism. He turned to history for guidance, recalling battles won against staggering odds, leaders who succeeded through perseverance, and civilizations that endured through resilience. These reflections served as counterweights to doubt, reminding him that the unfolding struggle, however dire, fit within a larger continuum of human endurance. In recognizing doubt as part of this continuum, he reframed it not as an enemy, but as a shadow that clarified the light. Ultimately, the flicker of doubt that accompanied Churchill through these difficult months became a testament to the complexity of his inner life. It revealed a leader capable of introspection, humility, and emotional depth, qualities that strengthened rather than weakened his resolve. While history often celebrates Churchill as a figure of unshakable confidence, the truth of his private war tells a richer story. Courage forged in uncertainty, strength born from vulnerability, vision shaped by moments of questioning. In wrestling with doubt, he affirmed the humanity that lay beneath the iconic image, and it was this humanity that enabled him to lead Britain with authenticity and unwavering conviction through the storm. As the war entered its harsh middle years, Churchill became increasingly aware of the profound loneliness that accompanied high command. It was a solitude not born of physical isolation. His days were filled with aides, advisors, ministers, and military men, but of the emotional distance created by responsibility. Even when surrounded by bustling activity, he often felt set apart, poised on a narrow ridge between the expectations of millions and the limits of human endurance. This loneliness took on a palpable presence in the quiet moments between meetings, when he paused at a window overlooking the darkened streets of London, sensing that the burdens he carried could be shared with no one entirely. Leadership, he understood, was ultimately a solitary vocation, demanding decisions whose consequences belonged to him alone. Churchill's solitude was sharpened by his acute sensitivity to the human cost of war. Reports he received daily, lists of casualties, summaries of bombings, letters forwarded from grieving families, stirred emotions he concealed behind steady resolve. He felt each loss deeply, not as numbers but as extinguished futures, broken homes and shattered moments of hope. These private reactions, though carefully hidden, contributed to the internal separation he felt from those around him. He could not express the full weight of this sorrow without risking the morale of those who depended upon his strength. Thus, he learned to carry grief in silence, adding it to the quiet war he waged within his heart. Compounding this loneliness was the necessity of making decisions that even his closest advisors could not fully influence. While he valued their expertise and welcomed debate, the final judgments, when to press an offensive, how to allocate dwindling resources, whether to risk diplomatic tension, rested with him. After heated discussions concluded and the cabinet dispersed, Churchill often remained seated for several minutes, absorbing the echoes of the arguments just exchanged. In these moments, the room felt both too large and too small, too large in its oppressive quiet, too small for the enormity of the choices that had been placed upon his shoulders. He sometimes wondered whether any human could truly prepare for such decisions. The emotional toll of command manifested in subtle rituals. After particularly difficult meetings, Churchill would wander through the dim corridors of the war rooms, trailing his fingers along the cold concrete walls as though seeking tactile reassurance. He paused before maps that glowed softly under their shaded lamps, tracing the lines of advancing fronts with a mixture of determination and dread. These solitary walks were not escapes but confrontations, moments when he acknowledged the isolation inherent in his role and gathered the psychological strength needed to step forward again. The physicality of movement helped steady the turbulence within him, grounding him in the narrow corridors that had become both his refuge and his confinement. At Chequers, the grand country residence that served as his temporary haven, the loneliness of command often felt sharper. Here, removed from the constant bustle of Downing Street, Churchill found the contrast between public duty and private emotion more pronounced. The quiet of the countryside, punctuated by the occasional distant aircraft, offered space for reflection that was both healing and painful. He walked the grounds slowly, hands clasped behind his back, contemplating strategy, memory, and the uncertain path before him. Though staff hovered discreetly nearby, he experienced these walks as solitary meditations, opportunities to confront the internal storms that he could not reveal to others. Churchill's family, though a source of profound love, could not fully pierce the isolation of leadership. His children wrote tender and encouraging letters, and Clementine offered steady affection and wise counsel. Yet the demands of war placed them on the periphery of his emotional life, not by choice but by necessity. When he sat with Clementine in the quiet of late evening, he sometimes longed to share the full truth of his fears and doubts. But he spoke only in measured tones, protecting her from the full gravity of his concerns. She sensed the unspoken weight he carried, yet both understood that their marriage, strengthened by decades of companionship, must bear the temporary veil of emotional restraint. The loneliness of command also revealed itself in Churchill's relationship with the past. Alone in his study late at night, he sometimes found solace or sorrow in revisiting old letters, notes, or passages from the books he loved. These relics of earlier life, before the thunder of war and the crushing responsibility of leadership, offered brief glimpses into the man he had been, a man with broader horizons and fewer burdens. Yet these reflections deepened his understanding of the present. By revisiting his former selves, he recognized the continuity of purpose that connected his life's trajectory. This recognition provided both comfort and melancholy, reminding him that every stage of life carried its own form of solitude. Despite the profound loneliness that permeated his wartime existence, Churchill discovered within it a source of surprising clarity. In the vast emotional space created by command, he found an intensified sense of purpose, an understanding that leadership required not only intellect and courage but the willingness to stand alone when necessary. This solitude honed his vision, sharpened his judgment, and strengthened his resilience. Though the world saw only the public Churchill, fierce, confident, indomitable, the private Churchill moved through a landscape shaped by introspection and quiet suffering. It was within this loneliness that he forged the inner steel that enabled him to guide Britain through its darkest years, embodying a leadership defined as much by silent endurance as visible strength. As the war approached its turning points, Churchill became increasingly aware that every step toward victory carried a profound and often unseen cost. Sacrifice had become the silent currency of Britain's endurance, paid in the shattered streets of cities, in the disciplined fatigue of soldiers, and in the quiet resilience of families who bore their suffering without fanfare. Churchill felt these sacrifices not as abstractions but as living presences that accompanied him through every decision. When he reviewed casualty lists or listened to reports of towns struck by bombings, he sensed the pulse of the nation's endurance and the magnitude of what was being asked from millions. In private moments, he wondered how he could ever repay such devotion, aware that his leadership drew strength from the willingness of ordinary people to give more than history had any right to demand. The weight of sacrifice pressed particularly hard on his conscience when he authorized operations that placed servicemen in peril. He understood the strategic necessity of each mission, yet he also understood the human price. He imagined the faces of young pilots preparing for night raids, naval crews bracing against freezing seas, and infantrymen advancing through devastated terrain. These imagined glimpses, shaped by his artist's sensitivity, carried an emotional truth that transcended official reports. Churchill knew that behind every arrow drawn on a map lay a constellation of personal stories, hopes, fears, and lives that could be extinguished by a single line of strategic reasoning. This awareness infused his decisions with gravity and humility, reminding him constantly of the fragile boundary between victory and loss. The burden was compounded by the knowledge that some sacrifices remained hidden from public awareness, obscured by secrecy or overshadowed by larger events. Intelligence operations, covert missions, and classified maneuvers demanded lives that could not be publicly honored, at least not yet. Churchill carried these invisible sacrifices with particular tenderness. He knew the stories of sailors lost in silent battles beneath the sea, of agents who vanished behind enemy lines, of bomber crews who flew knowing the odds were stacked against their return. Their anonymity amplified his sense of responsibility. In speeches, he could praise the courage of the nation, but in private he mourned those whose contributions history might never fully record. The home front carried its own form of sacrifice, one that Churchill felt deeply. He was moved by the stoic courage of civilians who endured long nights in shelters, who dug through rubble to salvage fragments of their former lives, who faced shortages and anxieties with a quiet determination that rivaled the resolve of soldiers. During his visits to bombed districts, he often paused before speaking, absorbing the devastation around him. The smell of smoke, the shattered windows reflecting bleak skies, the silent grief of families searching for cherished belongings, these scenes imprinted themselves upon his memory with haunting clarity. In these moments, Churchill sensed that the nation's true strength lay not only in its military prowess but in the indomitable spirit of its people. Sacrifice also touched his own family, though he rarely acknowledged it aloud. His children served or contributed in various ways, each carrying the emotional burden of having a father whose life was inseparable from danger and duty. Clementine bore her share of loneliness, anxiety, and unspoken fear, quietly accepting that the man she loved belonged not only to her but to history. Churchill was aware of the sacrifices his family made, and he felt a pang of guilt that he could not shelter them from the war's emotional demands. Yet he also cherished their unwavering support, drawing strength from the knowledge that their love endured through long separations and silent worry. Political sacrifice, too, weighed heavily on him. Churchill understood that many of his decisions carried political risks, even risks to his own leadership. He accepted these willingly, believing that the nation's survival far surpassed the importance of personal or party fortunes. There were nights when he contemplated the possibility of failure, when he acknowledged that history could judge him harshly if events turned against Britain. Yet he accepted this potential sacrifice with a sense of fatalistic determination, embracing the idea that leadership demanded the willingness to be misunderstood or even condemned for the sake of a greater good. This acceptance gave him a moral clarity that steadied him through countless trials. One of the deepest sacrifices Churchill faced was the loss of personal freedom. The demands of war left little room for recreation, introspection not bound to crisis, or the leisurely pursuits that once nourished his spirit. Painting, which had long been his refuge, became a rare indulgence. Its absence felt acutely in the unrelenting pace of wartime life. He missed the simple pleasure of capturing light across a pond or the shifting hues of a sunset. These moments of artistic escape had once helped him process emotion and find perspective, but now they were pushed aside by the pressing needs of the nation. This deprivation, though minor compared to the suffering of millions, represented a personal sacrifice that deepened his sense of isolation. Yet despite the immense weight of sacrifice that defined these years, Churchill perceived within it a powerful unifying force, one that fused the destinies of individuals into a collective struggle for survival and freedom. He understood that the sacrifices made across Britain were not merely acts of endurance but expressions of a profound moral commitment. This realization strengthened him. It reassured him that the enormous burdens he carried were shared in spirit by a nation that refused to succumb to despair. In acknowledging the sacrifices of others, he found the emotional resilience to continue his own quiet war, guiding Britain forward with a sense of gratitude, humility, and unwavering resolve. As the war's momentum slowly began to shift, Churchill felt the presence of history hovering more insistently over his thoughts, a vast, silent shadow stretching across his days and nights. It was not the abstract history of textbooks, but a living force that moved beside him, observing, judging, and reminding him that every action he took would echo into the future. Churchill had always been acutely aware of history's gaze. He had spent a lifetime studying it, writing it, conversing with its figures in the pages of his books. But now the shadow felt closer, heavier, as though the past itself had stepped into the war rooms, leaning over the maps with him. It was both companion and pressure, sharpening his resolve even as it deepened the solemnity of his decisions. This historical awareness infused Churchill's leadership with a unique dual consciousness. On one level, he dealt with the immediate, urgent demands of war: convoys under attack, supply shortages, complex alliances, sudden turns of fortune. On another level, he perceived the unfolding conflict through the wide-angle lens of centuries. He saw parallels in ancient wars, in the rise and fall of empires, in the resilience of nations pushed to their limits. This duality allowed him to maintain perspective even during moments of crisis. Yet it also heightened his sense of responsibility, for he recognized that Britain's survival would shape the moral and political landscape of the world for generations. This awareness made solitude more profound, decisions more weighty, and victories tinged with the melancholy of knowing their cost. Churchill often returned to the speeches and writings of earlier leaders, seeking both inspiration and warning. In the quiet of late evenings, he sometimes reread passages from Plutarch, Gibbon, or the memoirs of statesmen whose choices had altered the course of nations. These readings did not offer solutions but provided emotional anchoring, a reminder that others had stood where he stood, wrestling with dilemmas that demanded both courage and foresight. Yet he also feared the pitfalls that had ensnared past leaders: arrogance, complacency, the seductive illusion of destiny. The shadow of history was not always benevolent. It demanded humility, forcing him to examine his instincts with renewed caution. This relationship with history shaped Churchill's understanding of his own legacy, though he never allowed concerns for posterity to overshadow the pressing demands of the present. Still, in moments of introspection, he acknowledged that future generations might judge him with the clarity denied to those caught amid the fog of war. He wondered whether they would understand the complexities and contradictions of the choices he made, or whether they would see only victories and failures stripped of their context. These reflections were deeply personal. Churchill did not seek moral perfection in history's eyes, only the recognition that he had acted with honesty, conviction, and fidelity to the cause of freedom. Yet the uncertainty of this hoped-for understanding lingered quietly in the back of his mind, adding another layer to the quiet war within him. History also appeared to Churchill as a tapestry of human character, a parade of emotions, ambitions, loyalties, and betrayals. In observing the unfolding global conflict, he often analyzed not only strategy but the personalities of allies and adversaries. He understood that wars were shaped as much by the temperament of leaders as by the strength of armies. Roosevelt's warmth, Stalin's guarded realism, de Gaulle's pride, Hitler's fanaticism. These traits became threads in the larger historical fabric Churchill constantly sought to interpret. This sensitivity to character, rooted in his artist's eye for nuance, allowed him to navigate diplomatic turbulence with a blend of empathy and firmness. But it also deepened the emotional texture of his leadership, for he recognized the tragic human forces driving the war on all sides. The shadow of history followed Churchill even into the most mundane moments. When he walked through the underground corridors, he sometimes imagined future scholars analyzing their significance. When he stood on balconies overlooking bombed neighborhoods, he sensed that these scenes would someday become iconic images of resilience. The weight of this symbolic awareness was both motivating and burdensome. It reminded him that his private struggles were intertwined with the fate of millions and that history would remember not the man alone, but the embodiment of national defiance he had become. This subtle pressure shaped his posture, his rhetoric, and even the rhythm of his footsteps, compelling him to rise repeatedly to the demands of the moment. Yet Churchill did not always view history as an external force. At times, he felt it unfolding within him, shaped by the totality of his experiences: childhood memories, political battles, artistic triumphs, and past failures. The war had become a crucible, fusing together all aspects of his identity. His setbacks now sharpened his discernment. His artistic nature deepened his empathy. His literary sensibility enriched his understanding of narrative, perception, and memory. In this way, Churchill realized that history was not merely something he influenced. It was something he carried, a living amalgam of past and present that shaped his every decision. Ultimately, the shadow of history became both burden and beacon. It reminded Churchill that the war was not simply a contest of weapons but a moral struggle that would define the century and perhaps the character of civilization itself. This conviction strengthened him during dark hours, illuminating his path where logic alone could not. He understood that the private battles he fought, against loneliness, doubt, fatigue, and fear, were part of a larger historical arc. His quiet war, invisible to the nation, became a testament to the inner resilience that great leadership demands. In embracing the shadow of history, Churchill found a deeper sense of purpose, one that sustained him even when the burdens of command threatened to eclipse his spirit. As the war neared its end, Churchill found himself moving through a landscape transformed by the long struggle. Cities scarred yet standing, people exhausted yet unbroken, hopes fragile yet rising. Victory, once a distant abstraction sustained by sheer will, now approached with a solemn inevitability. Yet even as crowds prepared for celebration, Churchill felt the quiet war within him intensify. The end of conflict, he realized, would not bring an end to the burdens he carried, it would simply reshape them. He walked through the corridors of the war rooms with a contemplative air, aware that history was pivoting, and that in this shift lay both relief and a new kind of loneliness. The storms that had demanded his constant vigilance were passing, but the calm that followed revealed the full weight of the years he had endured. As reports of Allied breakthroughs arrived, Churchill experienced a complex mixture of triumph and sorrow. Each victory brought exhilaration, yet also a deep awareness of the cost at which it had been won. He saw the contrast sharply when visiting liberated towns, people cheering with an intensity that bordered on disbelief, while ruins stretched behind them like solemn reminders of suffering. Churchill absorbed these scenes with the emotional sensitivity that had always shaped his view of the world. He felt joy for the freedoms restored, but also a sharp, unspoken grief for the lives extinguished, the families broken, the cultures scarred. This duality, victory intertwined with mourning, marked his reflections in a way he seldom expressed publicly. In private, Churchill often pondered the invisible victories that would never be recorded in official documents. The resilience of Londoners during the Blitz, the sacrifice of sailors on convoy duty, the anonymous heroism of codebreakers working in secrecy, the quiet endurance of millions who faced hardship without complaint, these triumphs of spirit formed the true bedrock of the nation's survival. Churchill understood that his own role, however visible, had been only one part of a vast collective effort. This recognition humbled him. It reminded him that leadership was not a matter of personal glory, but a shared journey shaped by countless acts of courage and sacrifice that history might never fully illuminate. The approach of peace also brought moments of introspection about the emotional toll the war had taken upon him. Churchill's private struggles, doubt, fear, loneliness, the relentless pressure of expectation, had been constant companions, shaping his internal landscape with shadows that would linger long after victory. He knew that the public image carved by his wartime leadership concealed the profound vulnerability he carried in silence. In quiet moments, he wondered how these inner battles had altered him. The war had demanded that he construct an outer shell of indomitable strength, yet beneath that shell lay a man who had felt every loss acutely, who had wrestled with despair, who had carried the emotional burdens of millions. Yet even in these reflections, Churchill recognized that something profound had been forged within him. The quiet war he fought, the unseen struggle against fatigue, fear, and emotional collapse, became the foundation of his resilience. Through it, he learned that courage was not the absence of inner conflict, but its mastery. He discovered that leadership required not only strategic brilliance and rhetorical power, but the ability to maintain integrity under immense emotional strain. This realization brought him a sense of peace. He had not been perfect, no leader ever is, but he had endured with authenticity, guided by a deep conviction in the righteousness of the cause. In this, he found a quiet form of triumph far more personal than the public celebration of victory. The final days of the war offered Churchill moments of stillness that he had not experienced in years. He stood at windows watching spring sunlight fall across the gardens, listened to birdsong that had once been drowned by sirens, and allowed himself to breathe without the constant pressure of imminent crisis. These small scenes, so ordinary yet so profound, stirred emotions he had long suppressed. Churchill felt gratitude for the simple continuity of life, for the resilience of nature, for the possibility of reflection unshaped by emergency. These moments reminded him of the world he had fought to preserve, a world of families, freedoms, and quiet mornings, and he felt renewed purpose in ensuring its protection in the fragile peace ahead. When victory was finally declared, and the nation erupted in joy, Churchill stepped into the public eye with a heart shaped by the long-hidden journey that few would ever fully understand. He waved to the crowds, his face carrying the familiar defiant confidence, yet behind his eyes lay the memory of nights spent alone in contemplation, moments of doubt that almost broke him, and the steady courage that had carried him forward. As he addressed the jubilant nation, he knew that his voice now carried not only the weight of triumph but the echoes of his internal battles. The people saw in him a symbol of victory. He felt within himself the quiet victory of having endured the deepest test of his life. In the years that followed, Churchill's legacy became firmly etched in the annals of history, yet the private struggles he carried remained largely invisible. The world remembered the speeches, the defiance, the strategic insight, the unwavering leadership. But the quieter victory, the triumph of a man who faced exhaustion, fear, doubt, and loneliness without succumbing, resided in a more intimate realm. It lived in the silence of the war rooms, in the introspective moments of fading lamplight, in the corridors where he walked alone with his thoughts. This was the victory that defined the essence of Churchill's humanity. His quiet war, fought far from public acclaim, revealed the depth of character that enabled him to lead a nation through darkness and toward the light. And in that unseen triumph lay the true measure of his greatness.